Professor Camilla Naidu, the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Catherine Botha, Professor Aili Breshnayan from the University of Dayton, Ohio, our online audience on YouTube and Facebook, senior leaders of the university, members of Senate and other academics, family and friends of Professor Botha, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Sanibonani, Goeienaand, good evening, Tobela, Molweni. It is indeed a great honor and special privilege to welcome you to the Professorial Inauguration Lecture of Professor Catherine Botha. As I do so, I wish to express a warm welcome to her loved ones, special guests, and her colleagues. This is indeed a proud and joyful, yet a landmark moment for all of you, for Professor Botha, and of course for us here at UJ and higher education in South Africa and beyond. The inauguration of professors is a public ceremony in which newly appointed professors are inducted into office by the Vice-Chancellor and deliver their inaugural address. The ceremony has its roots in the medieval university and serves multiple purposes. Firstly, it is an expression of welcome and an entry for new professors joining the circle of colleagues who are already professors. Secondly, it provides a platform for the professors to display their expertise in the discipline and showcase their research. In isiXhosa, we say, I quote, "Ukuthweswa isidanga kwisigaba sobunjingalwazi," close quote, loosely translated. This means assuming the role of the professor. Of course, in colonial traditions subscribed to by universities, this refers to the gown and the cap. Traditionally, the wise one would accept a blanket, ingubo. Once we have listened to the inaugural address, the gown or ingubo denoting the professorship will be formally assumed. Today, we gather to bear witness to the entry of Professor Botha to the illustrious community of scholars at the university. It is a celebration of the contributions to the discipline and ultimately the impact on society. Professors provide a university with its identity, character, and academic legitimacy and integrity. The inaugural lecture is a rite of passage following the confirmation of the appointment of a professor. This evening, we listen to Professor Botha as the gown goes to town. By this I mean that the power of the inaugural address is when the expertise is showcased beyond the corridors of the university and reverberates throughout society. It stands out as a moment of pride for the incumbent, the family, fellow scholars, the university, and ultimately society. For the German philosopher and diplomat Humboldt, a university refers to the whole community of scholars and students engaged in a common search for truth. Newman talked about teaching universal knowledge. Recently, universities have been viewed as instrumentalists, serving the purpose of the economy or utilitarian in purpose. I would hope that we can break out of these narrow conceptualizations and reflect on the university as contributing to the public good. Edward said in an article, I quote, on defiance and taking positions, offers a formulation of the ideal role of a true intellectual as, I quote, one who commands a vast knowledge of his or her discipline, who is rigorous in the analysis of literature, who views being an intellectual as a vocation, the intellectual who considers it necessary to step into the public sphere and to speak truth to power, namely, to question, interpret, and to understand authority rather than consolidating it, to step out of the boundaries of the academy to connect oneself, to affiliate oneself, to align oneself, with an ongoing process or contest of some sort, perhaps with the aim of improving the lot of the oppressed. The intellectual who functions as a kind of public memory to recall what is forgotten or ignored, to make the connections that are otherwise hidden, and to provide alternatives to mistaken policies, close quote. It remains then for us as a university with a Pan-Africanist vision to derive our mandate as intellectuals and as professors. How do we embrace the role of a professor as a disruptor while continuing to be flagship carriers of our disciplines? This evening, we will listen to Professor Botha as one further step in the journey of being a professor. This is a journey which does not culminate once this lecture has been given. It is a self-reflecting pause in the journey of a professor with a promise of more to enrich our minds as simultaneously contributing to the rich intellectual body in the discipline. I would like now to invite the Executive Dean, Professor Camilla Naidu, to introduce Professor Botha. Thank you very much. Ya lebuha. Bayadanki.
Thank you, Dr. Vukuza. Good evening, Dumelang, Sani Bonani, Goeienaand. I'm going to read the CV of Professor Catherine Botha. Catherine joined UJ Philosophy in 2009. A C1 NRF-rated researcher, her research is focused mainly on aesthetics and the philosophy of art, with a specialization in the relatively underexplored area of the philosophy of dance. Her research niche aligns well with her strong background in dance. She is a registered teacher and associate member of the Royal Academy of Dance and has presented free adult ballet classes at the UJ Arts Academy as a community service project since 2014. In this capacity, she has choreographed numerous dance works for the University of Johannesburg's Arts Academy, giving students who otherwise might never have had the opportunity to experience the art of stage dance the chance to experience the hard work and exhilaration involved. Catherine's research background lies in the phenomenological tradition and its precursors in the continental tradition, most especially the work of Nietzsche and Heidegger, and this is often the lens through which she approaches her writing in aesthetics. Her doctorate entitled Heidegger, Nietzsche, and the Question of Value was awarded by the Radboud University and Nijmegen under the supervision of Professor Dr. Paul van Tongeren. To date, Catherine has been invited keynote speaker at 6 international conferences and has published 28 papers in journals or edited collections. She has also appeared in a number of podcasts, including most recently one entitled Experience, a collaborative podcast series hosted by the philosopher Dr. Valery Vinogradovs. Catherine has co-published one book with another book and special journal issue forthcoming. In addition, she has solo published an edited volume entitled African Some Aesthetics, Cultures, Feminisms, Politics. This book brings together new research on the body in African cultures, specifically interrogating the possibilities of the contribution of a some aesthetic approach in the context of colonization, decolonization, and globalization in Africa. This is an original and exciting contribution to the existing literature. All these works evidence the way in which her research brings together her two passions, the philosophy of art and 19th and 20th century continental philosophy. As with her research, Catherine's teaching experience is extensive and outstanding. She won the UJ Vice-Chancellor's Distinguished Award for Most Promising Young Teacher in 2014 and the UJ Vice-Chancellor's Distinguished Award for Best Teacher in 2020, the first time in UJ's history that a candidate has won both awards. She was also a 2020 nominee for the UJ Faculty of Humanities Best Teacher Student Choice Award and has been invited to present numerous workshops on teaching best practice and academic skills. She's been an invited keynote speaker at various teaching and learning conferences and has also been an invited member of quality assurance review panels for a number of universities. Catherine's ability and willingness to take up substantial administrative and leadership tasks includes her term as head of the philosophy department from 2015 to 2018, a member of a number of UJ internal panels, and secretary of the South African Society for Greek Philosophy and the Humanities, and also co-secretary of the South African Center for Phenomenology for a number of years. Catherine has an excellent track record for successful funding applications, including grants and awards from the NRF, the DHET, the AAMP, the URC, and Universitas 21. So Professor Botha, we are immensely proud and pleased to have you in our faculty, and we look forward to your talk now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Prof. Camilla. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here in person or online this evening. It's such a great pleasure to be here. As a philosopher of dance, I'm privileged today to be able to present to you two aspects of my work. I begin by inviting you to watch an excerpt from a dance piece I recently choreographed. And then I will proceed to present to you a truncated version of a paper that I wrote that is focused on one aspect of my work in the philosophy of dance, the problem of the ephemerality of dance. So we'll play the dance work now.
I'm worried about him. No news for so long. Is he getting enough to eat? How is he holding up? Why is the queue not moving? Why is she taking so long at the front? I'm worried about him. No news for so long. Is he getting enough to eat? How is he holding up? Why is the queue not moving? Why is she taking so long?
So imagine you go and view the Mona Lisa, and you enjoy viewing that artwork, and then a friend of yours goes to view the Mona Lisa 3 years later. There seems to be no problem at all in agreeing that you're viewing the same artwork. Let's ignore the possibility of theft and counterfeits for the sake of the argument here. And also, there seems to be no problem in agreeing that the Mona Lisa is indeed an artwork. Visual artworks seem to be pretty straightforward because there's a physical artifact that you can see. But what happens with performed works like dances? If there was no recording of senseless kindness like the one that you watched now, but rather that you'd watched that artwork performed in the theatre, and then you had a friend who watched it performed by different dancers, not the UJ adult ballet dancers, but rather different dancers in 3 years' time, say in Amsterdam, would it still be the same dance? How would you know? And of course, could we even call dance an artwork? Because if the artwork disappears in the very act of appearing, how can it be a work at all? Now, this is the problem of the ephemerality of dance. The problem that dance is an event that disappears in the very act of materializing. And it's this one that is the focus of this paper that I present to you today. I argue today that Martin Heidegger's conception of the Augenblick, and I'm going to translate that loosely as the moment, provides us with a means to rethink the ephemerality problem, specifically because it provides us with a means for understanding the dance performance as an art of becoming rather than an art of disappearing. As part of my argument, I will show that it's Friedrich Nietzsche, in whose light and shadow Heidegger always works, who is able to provide the language for Heidegger to expose the inadequacies of what Heidegger sees as the traditional linear view of time, the staticist view of time. So what will I do today? I'm going to begin by briefly setting out the ephemerality problem as it appears in the literature. Then I'll provide a very brief exposition of the concept of Augenblick, and I'll concentrate my analysis on Heidegger's work in Sein und Zeit and his very early Nietzsche lectures. Then I will show how Heidegger very willfully misreads Nietzsche in order to ensure that it's his own elaboration of the concept of time and the concept of Augenblick that appear as an alternative to the traditional linear model of time. In other words, an attempt to ask what it would mean to think time differently and how we as human beings could possibly incorporate such a thought. Finally, I provide some ideas on how this conception can be a fruitful way of approaching the ephemerality problem. So let's begin then with dance as an ephemeral art. The impermanence of dance has elicited a number of varying responses, which can be roughly divided into three types. First, there are those theorists who think it's trivial or unproblematic. So Redfern, for example, thinks it doesn't matter. And then there are those who think it's got negative consequences. I'll speak about those in a moment. And then there are a few who think that the problem can indeed be reconceptualized in a positive way. So I'm not going to talk about those who see it as non-trivial, because I don't think it is. And let's look at two theorists who see it as negative. So one of these is French philosopher Alain Badiou, who in his Handbook of Inaesthetics begins with the claim that dance is not an art. And then he provides support for that claim by outlining 6 principles of dance. He says that his principles are premised on the idea that, and I'm quoting, dancing gestures appear only to disappear. So we see the ephemerality problem already appearing here. And so, I'm quoting again, demonstrate thought as event, but before this thought has received a name, at the extreme edge of its veritable disappearance, in its vanishing without the shelter of a name. So unfortunately, I can't talk about Badiou's attempt to develop a quasi-Platonic ideal of art, and nor the substantial problems that his objective phenomenology raises. But Badiou's position is important in the context of my presentation because it highlights how significant a problem the ephemerality problem really is. Why? Because the ephemerality problem can lead us to deny dance's status as an art. Another theorist who takes up a negative position is Graham McPhee. But in contrast to Badiou, McPhee wants to accord dance its status as an art. His view is that the instability of dance works as art is merely a problem resulting from the poor preservation and reconstruction of dances, rather than a feature that tells us anything meaningful about the nature of dance. So McPhee proposes a thesis of notationality as a minimal answer for the question of identity in dance. This entails that two performances are of the same work, and here I'm quoting, just in case both satisfy or instantiate some particular text in notation agreed by the knowledgeable in the art form to be an adequate notation for that form. So here we're looking for forms of notation like Laban notation, or perhaps something like Benesch notation. Now, this is the idea that fills out McPhee's use of the type token distinction to develop his position on the ephemerality problem. This is a very familiar one to philosophers. So for McPhee, the type that constitutes a dance work of art is tokened by the various instancing performances of it. And so when we put this together with his notationality thesis, McPhee tells us the ephemerality problem is overcome. Now, McPhee's position has been criticized on a number of fronts, especially because of the problematic importance being given to notation, but also for the ontological assumptions underlying the use of his type token distinction. Anna Pakes, for example, has recently highlighted these and argued for an alternative position where the dance work's dependence on the human body, as well as the historical and contextual factors, is underscored. So those are two negative views. In contrast, there are some positive views. Renee Conroy is an example of a theorist who supports such a position. She agrees with McPhee that dance is an ephemeral art, and even so, it should be conceived, she says, as a way of conveying a communal attitude of tolerance for change with respect to choreography that has been previously performed. That is, as a dance world value, rather than as a problem to be solved. So Mark Franco puts it like this. He says, the idea that the ephemerality of dance is a flaw that can be repaired via attempts to fix the art form is just misguided. My question then is, can Heidegger's understanding of the Augenblick be seen as a precursor in any sense to some of these positive positions? I think it can, and so what I do in what follows is show how Heidegger's very Nietzschean critique of the traditional linear model of time that emerges in his concept of the Augenblick does just that. Why? Because it doesn't reduce the ephemerality problem to the mere trivial, but in revealing it as being symptomatic of a problematic understanding of the nature of time, gives us a meaningful way to approach the problem. So let's have a look at what Heidegger says about the Augenblick. Heidegger's use of the Augenblick changes in focus and inspiration, but we can say it's motivated by concern to develop a concept of time that is freed from what he calls the metaphysics of presence. What could that be? It's a traditional ontology that emphasizes the enduring presence of that which is ultimately real. In other words, the view that entails that that which is ultimately real is that which underlies properties, that which remains continuously present throughout all change. Now, in 1937, in his lecture course on Nietzsche, Heidegger tells us that we need to read Nietzsche's thought of the eternal return in a very specific way, a way that he calls the correct way. And he says we do that if we meet two conditions. First, he says we must think the thought of the eternal return in terms of the Augenblick, the moment. And second, that we must think the thought as an overcoming of nihilism. So what on earth is nihilism, and what, of course, is the eternal return? Very shortly here this evening, the idea of the eternal return, or recurrence as it's sometimes translated, is a highly contested idea, and one that is presented by Nietzsche in the Gay Science, aphorism 341. The aphorism is called The Greatest Weight, and I want to read it to you. So this is what Nietzsche says about the eternal return. He says, what if some day or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life as you live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more. And there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment, and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. So this is the eternal return in Nietzsche's words. What about nihilism? I can't tell you what Nietzsche says about nihilism. We might be here till next week, but let me tell you what Heidegger says very shortly. Heidegger thinks that Nietzsche's account of nihilism is incomplete because, from Heidegger's point of view, the history of nihilism is in fact the history of metaphysics. In Heidegger's reading, nihilism is the result of our failure to think the nothing. In other words, thinking the nothing for Heidegger is a thoughtful confrontation with the nihil in our mortal human existence, as well as in the history of the oblivion of being and the abandonment by being. So, very, very complex idea here that Heidegger gives to us. But let's return to Heidegger's claim then that we need to understand Nietzsche's concept of the eternal return, that I explained to you, as the overcoming of nihilism. How does he do this? Heidegger interprets Nietzsche's description in Zarathustra of a shepherd who had a snake that had bit fast into his mouth and so had incorporated itself in him. Heidegger says that the weightiness of the thought of the return cannot be understood until you have experienced the disgust of nihilism. How does he explain that? It's the disgust the shepherd experiences when the head of the snake fills his mouth. Zarathustra tells the shepherd to bite the snake's head off, and when the shepherd does so in Nietzsche's story in Zarathustra, the shepherd is able to laugh. He is freed, says Heidegger, from the disgust of nihilism and transforms into someone who is able to think the thought of the eternal return. So Heidegger tells us in this reading then, nihilism cannot be overcome from the outside or by tearing away at it or by shoving it aside. Each of us must bite into the matter of nihilism ourselves. We cannot give the task to another. So this is one condition that Heidegger gives us. But the other condition is the one that's important to me, thinking the thought of the return in terms of the Augenblick. And Heidegger interestingly tells us that they cohere together to such an extent that they are really one condition. Why? Because the bite that severs the head of the snake is the decisive moment, Augenblick, that interrupts nihilism. So in Heidegger's view, to think the thought of the return in terms of the moment means transposing ourselves to the temporality of independent action and decision, glancing ahead at what is assigned us as our task and back at what is given us as our endowment. Now, this is a highly problematic claim that I'm not going to go into much detail about. What I want to underline here is that we can turn to this understanding of the moment that Heidegger gives us here and see how it's echoed in Sein und Zeit. In Sein und Zeit, Heidegger provides a questioning of human beings being in time, hence the title, in order to approach the question of being, the question of existence. And specifically, Heidegger posits that Dasein's understanding of its existence is given in and through time in the form of the moment. So he provides right there in the beginning of Being in Time a very approving allusion to Nietzsche's eternal return. He says, authentic historicity understands history as the recurrence, so here we get the word return, of what is possible, and knows what a possibility recurs only when existence is open for it in the moment in resolute retrieve. So already in Being in Time, we can see how the Augenblick, the moment, is part of Heidegger's attempt to express Dasein, or human beings' authentic relation to time and history. Heidegger says that understood formally, every present makes present, but not every present is in the moment. What on earth could he mean? Well, he says, ever since ancient ontology, human beings and other beings have been grasped in terms of presence. In other words, they have been understood according to a definite mode of time, the present, the now. And his assertion that in Western thinking, being has been determined according to that one mode of time, the present, is what Heidegger problematizes in Being in Time, but of course in all his writings thereafter. So to help you understand that, think of a mountain range, and this is the example that Heidegger himself uses. When you observe a mountain range, the range is present to you. It lies before you, as Heidegger would say in his language, unconcealed. Yet that the mountain is unconcealed or present can only be possible as part of a larger context of unconcealment. In other words, those things that you don't notice when you're looking at the mountain. So the presence of particular things, says Heidegger, can only occur in the open space of a more original unconcealedness of beings as a whole. It is this aspect of presence that Heidegger believes has been forgotten by the metaphysical tradition. So his point then is to tell us that we need to understand the nothing, das Nichts as he calls it, to develop a better understanding of presence and time. Now tonight here I can't give you a complete exposition of Heidegger's thinking on this very complex term, the nothing, das Nichts. But I think it's enough for me to say here that for Heidegger, the nothing is not a thing. So it's unfortunate that we have to say the nothing in our translation. It's also not a denial or a not, but rather it is, and this is a very loose translation, annihilating force that is intertwined in the happening of being, in the presencing of being that we were discussing when we were talking about the mountain. So, as he explores the nothing, Heidegger's claim that philosophy has forgotten the question of being can be better understood. Existence, or being, is never transparently present, but rather present only in relation to an absence of both the no longer and the not yet, the past and the future. And it's in the context of this theoretical background that Heidegger's claim that not every present is in the moment can be understood. So, what is particularly interesting is that the authentic conception of time as the moment that we find in Being in Time, and the oblique reference to the Nietzschean view of the moment as the eternal return, is not maintained by Heidegger. We see in the later lectures that the eternal return is later read by Heidegger as if it arrests becoming rather than promotes it. So Heidegger then later tells us that Nietzsche's view is that the eternal return and the connected concept, the Nietzschean concept of the will to power, is related to a continual bringing back into stability. And so the later Heidegger turns against himself and against Nietzsche and tells us that the eternal return is, strangely now, the most constant permanentizing of the unstable. And so Nietzsche becomes yet another figure in Heidegger's history of metaphysics. So Heidegger's earlier view of the Nietzschean moment as the site of the collision between past and future, where what is returns is decided, can be better understood if we see it in contrast with his later view where he reverses here. And Nietzsche then becomes someone who is firmly entrenched in the tradition that Heidegger wants to destroy. So, in sum, in his attempt to characterize time and the Augenblick, Heidegger systematizes Nietzsche's thought of the return into a metaphysics. He willfully misreads Nietzsche to ensure that it is rather his own elaboration of the concepts of time and Augenblick that appear as an alternative to the traditional linear model of time. So, despite my assertion that Heidegger misreads Nietzsche, the way in which he attempts to reconceptualize time with and against Nietzsche is, I think, the way in which we can approach the ephemerality problem. How? Reading Heidegger's work on time and presence shows how he would suggest that it is the conception of time underlying the articulation of the ephemerality problem that is, in fact, the problem. If we question the traditional view of time, then the ephemerality problem is no longer a problem in the way in which theorists tell us it is. So in Heidegger's thinking, lived time does not refer to clock time, but to how time is experienced by us as human beings. This means that Heidegger's description of the Augenblick as an ecstasy of time, those times when past and future are realized in the present, or as he says, in the moment of vision, when we lose track of time in the dance, in the watching of an artwork, when we lose that track of time, our consciousness is not divided, our lived dualisms disappear, and the unity of our being is experienced. And so the ephemerality of dance can then be perceived not as a problem or as a lack, but rather a suggestion that if we reject the traditional metaphysical understanding of time, our experience of the arts and our lived experience in general can be conceived differently. How? The negative conception of the ephemerality problem relies on a conception of time as a discrete series of nows, with the past remaining irretrievable from the perspective of the moment of the present. If we use Heidegger's conception, this problem is dissolved. If we can use Heidegger's conception to reconceive the ephemerality problem, we see the dance performance as an art of becoming rather than of disappearing. Every artwork can be conceived not as atemporal, not as non-spatial, but rather as a singular, unrepeatable event. The artwork and the spectator both appear in the moment. Now, you may want to object that some arts produce an enduring object that we can appreciate repeatedly, in contrast to the performance when we watch dance, the Mona Lisa example from the beginning. But this objection ignores the radicality of what I'm trying to show Heidegger is doing with his reconceptualization of time. As in the art of performance, where the work itself appears to disappear, the moment of the encounter with any artwork can be said to disappear in its appearance, in the same way that Heidegger's description of the mountain I related earlier shows how that mountain is unconcealed or present, and can only be so as part of a larger context of unconcealment. As I explained, the presence of particular things can, for Heidegger, only occur in the open space of a more original unconcealedness of beings as a whole. So from a Heideggerian perspective, the present remains impossibly irretrievable in our experience of every artwork. But this does not mean that the present is unknowable. It means that our very existence is the place where the moment happens. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Hello, can everyone hear me okay? Yes? Okay, I'll start. I'm so pleased to have this honor of contributing to the Professorial Inauguration of Catherine Botha, someone whose standing in the international community of dance philosophers is well established due to her thoroughly researched, innovative, and insightful publications and presentations. I first met Professor Botha in person when she presented a paper on the dancing body and the transmission of collective memory in South Africa in a panel that I chaired on Afro-Caribbean dance at the American Society for Aesthetics in New Orleans in November of 2017. Her deep and thoughtful consideration of apartheid's physical legacy on the dancing body was one that has affected my thinking ever after, on how cultural memories live within us long after the events that give rise to them are over. The excerpt from the essay that she's discussed today extends this research forward while reaching back into the insights of continental philosophers Friedrich Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger. Nietzsche and Heidegger thus fund her thinking about the nature of dance as ephemeral in performance, even if continuing in bodily memory. In carrying this work from the past into the present, she's doing something quite Heideggerian. Botha has shown us that Heidegger resists the linear motion of time and in this way adapts Nietzsche's work into his own metaphysics, and she follows in his footsteps. Indeed, in Sein und Zeit, he claims that the content of present temporality is not limited to the content of the moment, and that being is more than the simply given. It also incorporates the nothing that is part of encountering something for the first time in an authentic moment in which we find something ready to hand. In short, Professor Botha is also being Heideggerian when she reinterprets Marcia Siegel's journalistic statement about dance's ephemerality with the help of Heidegger's conception of the Augenblick, a blink of the eye moment that shows us how we might understand dance performance as an art of becoming rather than of disappearing. Botha points out that Heidegger's view adds a philosophy of time to the analysis that initially incorporated Nietzsche's idea of time as a sequence of inert moments that return eternally, and later showed how the idea of revenge can be connected to Nietzsche's will that wills itself eternally. Finally, Botha points out that Heidegger asks us to read these ideas in a way that overcomes nihilism by biting into it and experiencing the fleeting disgust of doing so, as when the shepherd laughs after biting off the head of the snake, and thus spake Zarathustra, even though the action initially filled him with disgust. This means that Heidegger departs from Nietzsche's conception of time as a presence that is permanent in a way that he still thinks is Nietzschean. In short, as Botha explains, Nietzsche's moment is reconceived by Heidegger as the site of collision between past and future, where what it returns is decided and can be better understood. Her work differs from that of other philosophers on the Augenblick due to what she notices with Nietzsche's profound influence on Heidegger, even while Heidegger purposefully misinterpreted Nietzsche in furtherance of his own understanding. Botha also accepts as true on this reconceived notion of ephemerality that dance is an ephemeral art in a non-trivial way, something that she points out is not an uncontroversial idea in dance philosophy. Indeed, Botha shows us how on a Heideggerian analysis, the passage of time itself is ephemeral. Moments are always becoming, which is why there's nothing strange or worrying about the idea that dance is an ephemeral art form. It simply shows that Heidegger's view of how time works is true. Botha shows those who deny that dance is an ephemeral art in a meaningful way. She shows that They're either misunderstanding the import of the issue, Betty Redfern, or assuming mistakenly that temporal things can have permanence at all, Alain Badiou and Graham McPhee. In this way, contemporary champions of the idea that dance is meaningfully ephemeral, Rene Conroy, Mark Franco, Peggy Phelan, and Andre Lepecki, are confirming Heidegger's anti-Platonic insight, whether they realize this connection or not. Rather than just rehash what Professor Botha has done here, though, I'm attempting to point out today, in her honor, what kind of philosophical mastery, historical analysis, and understanding of both dance and the nature of time Botha's work here demonstrates. An essay like this, one that is typical of Botha's work, analyzes and deconstructs while it preserves, applying analytic rigor to both continental philosophy and dance criticism, underscored by her understanding of the dance art phenomenon under analysis. What this means is that Botha is a triple threat, and that her students and colleagues are benefited by what she brings to the table, ×3. I hope this short comment shows what I and others who know Professor Botha's work know to be true, that she is richly deserving of this professorial inauguration. Indeed, it may be the case that inaugurees of the future will be citing not just canonical greats, but the work of philosopher and professor Catherine Botha.
Yeah. Shall I invite Professor Botha to the podium, please? Come here. Come forward. Stay to the left. Congratulations, Professor Botha.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations. Congratulations once again, Professor Botha. You look splendid this evening. Well done and all the best. All the best in your journey. Thank you very much. Shall we rise? Thank you.